Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sarah Pentecost, and I'm here with APA Virginia staff. Thanks for joining us for our monthly webinar series, Your Hour with APA Virginia, sponsored by the Berkeley Group. Our webinars are the fourth Monday of each month from noon to 1 p.m., covering different topics in planning and related fields. Today, we have Chuck Dupree from Richmond, Virginia, presenting the rapidly changing face of economic development. We'll take all questions at the end. You can type them into the questions box here and go to webinar. And once the webinar is completed, we'll upload it to YouTube within 24 hours. Please mark your calendars for next month's webinar on October 3rd, Building Community Capacity and Resilience Through Pre-Disaster Recovery Planning with Michelle Diamond and Kevin Snyder of FEMA Region 3. And again, that is on Monday, October 23rd. Additionally, APA Virginia is pleased to announce the 2018 annual conference, Mountains of Influence at Wintergreen Resort on July 22nd through 25th, 2018. Visit apavirginia.com for information on call for proposals, award nominations, and sponsorship opportunities. I'm now going to hand this over to Chuck so we can get started. And thank you for joining us.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Chuck Dupree, and I am principal of a firm called Downtown Economics here in Richmond, Virginia. But I also have a few other firms. One is called the Downtown Entrepreneurship Project. The other is called Retail Incubations. The other is Real Charrettes. And the other, which is sort of my nonprofit kind of do-goody organization, is Stop the Big Box. So I am actively involved in, I guess, the line between economic development and planning, and have been involved in the field for about 30 years now. Just to give you a quick background about me, not to bore you to death, but I started actually as an undergrad as an English major, and then became a journalism major in grad school. And that somehow led to economic development. And that's a long story, but my first job was in Lowell, Massachusetts, worked for a private developer. I worked in Hollywood, Florida, Washington, D.C., Montpelier, Vermont, Toronto, Jacksonville, Florida, most recently here in Richmond. So I've been up and down the East Coast, but I've also consulted in probably 300 communities nationally on economic development issues, although I would say my specialty is downtown revitalization. I could have, as I was thinking of a title for this webinar, and I'm going to go back to the first slide, the rapidly changing face of economic development. I probably could have written this slide 20 or 25 years ago, and it would still be relevant, because the change has been slow, and now it is, the rapidity is amazing. And to those of us that have been around economic development and planning, it's great to see. The old school approach to economic development was, let's find a site somewhere in town. Let's get the Chamber of Commerce together. Let's get the business leaders together. Let's put some marketing materials together, and then let's go out and try to attract a business from another community, another state. This was before globalization, really, so it was mostly within the U.S. and a little bit in Canada. As I put on there, it's really, that's on its last breath. That was on its last breath 15, 20 years ago, or at least on a respirator. That approach, I have to say, remains somewhat viable, or at least used in the Deep South and Midwest today, but is rapidly changing elsewhere. But the whole idea was, let's go out and get that big business for the community, and that will change the whole economic development scope within the community. Economic development recruitment was a huge part of that. In the past, and you can read this, but 70% of an economic development agency's budget was allocated to the recruitment of major industry. Now, I'm going to say a lot of this was just wasted money. I did a CD back in '95 saying that marketing for economic development was the most wasted dollar in the municipal budget. There were trade shows, ads, and there are magazines specializing just in advertising for economic development. Come to our city, come to our county, come to our downtown, come to our commercial district. Special events were held, huge budgets, and usually a combination of local, state, and federal money, but a lot of money was being spent on economic development recruitment. Today, that number has fallen to about 50% of an ED agency's budget. And of course, the social media has changed that a bit. So rather maybe a trade show or an ad, you're on Facebook or Twitter or wherever. But still, 50% is a substantial number. That number is projected to fall to 30% by 2025. Colleagues that I talked to at, in fact, one yesterday at UCLA, thinks that'll drop to 10% by 2025, because that's just no longer the way we do economic development. And let's just walk through that process and the way the process used to work. A piece of land was in XYZ, Ohio. XYZ, Ohio took out an ad in one of the magazines or publications and said, come here and we'll give you some incentives. This is the best piece of land. Our community is great. But every community was doing that. And if one thinks about that from a marketing perspective in 2017, that just makes no sense. Now, I have to say, there's a group of people called site selectors. They're consultants. And what they do is go out and find sites for businesses. And the accompanying site selection publications that I mentioned earlier, I don't really want to mention them by name. They're getting very nervous. And they're getting nervous because communities are now taking control of the process. Having to go out and just, advertise and go to trade shows and a lot of those were, they're frankly dominated by older white men playing golf. That began to fade away and didn't work. So we're looking at new approaches. The other problem we have in terms of change right now is economic development programming. And I think some of the planners in the crowd can appreciate this. Who's in charge of economic development? there's substantial overlap in programming, and this is creating budgetary issues at both the county and city level, and even at the state level, and confusion among community leaders in terms of who's in charge. Is it the Economic Development Agency? Is it the Chamber of Commerce? Is it the Planning Department? Commonwealth agencies here in Virginia? County government? The Downtown Development Authority? I think there's been a much more concerted effort to streamline economic development programming, but much more remains to be done. And I think one of the questions that we all, as planners, as economic development people, have to ask ourselves is, why do so many agencies still remain doing the same thing? I will give you an anecdote. It's a few years old. This is like a consultant's dream. I was sitting in my home office about 8 o'clock on a Thursday night, and I got a phone call from the Economic Development Director of the City of Miami. And she said, look, I'm new. I'm from New Orleans. I need an assessment of my economic development agency. And I have a pretty hefty budget. So it was a pretty good night for me. So I, having lived in Miami before, went down there and took a look around. And what was interesting to me was the fact, yes, the city of Miami had an economic development agency. Literally across the street, perhaps the most prestigious economic development agency in the country, the Beacon Council, was there. A half block up was the Downtown Development Authority. Within less than a mile was the County Economic Development Agency. There were 34 community development corporations. There were, I don't know how many planning agencies from different organizations, including transit organizations. So we had all of these economic development people, these not just people, but agencies, planners, and money was being just wasted. And cities are now catching on to this. Now, one of the things that you don't want to do as a consultant, which I did, was I called for the elimination of the department that had hired me, the City of Miami Economic Development Agency. I said, look, there's no need for this. We have every agency under the sun within a mile here. And if you cross the bridge to Miami Beach, there were even more. If you went north into Broward County, yet even more. So I think one of the things that's now starting to catch on is, and I do this webinar all the time called Who's in Charge? Who's in charge of economic development programming? Ideally, what we have found, and internally through my consulting agencies, we've done studies, is that it's best to have the planning department and the economic development agency together under one roof, working together, and perhaps other agencies as well. The Downtown Development Authority occasionally, but you know, that's something that's kind of in the air locally that people can pick up. The other thing people can pick up is when there are too many people in charge. And I think that when it comes to changes in economic development and the changing phase of economic development programming. This is a big one. Who's in charge, and where's the money going? Particularly during tight budgetary times. And the other thing is that I talk about frequently is the thrill of the chase. It's going and almost gone. This goes back to one of my earlier slides. The chase for big business, that game is over. That ended 5 years ago, 5 to 7 years ago. On the map, you see the biggest employers and in various states. And what often would happen is, as you all well know, we'd go from state to state to try to lure businesses, so they would come to our community with the idea they'd pay taxes and they would employ more people, and it would create a sense of, we're a little bit better than that state. For years, we called it the war between the states relative to economic development programming. That has become passé. Even the chase for a corporate headquarters is now becoming passé. There was a very interesting example last year. 2 years ago, General Electric was headquartered in Connecticut. The city of Boston decided they wanted GE to be headquartered there. So they put their planners and their economic development people to work to create the best site on the waterfront for GE. Well, as it turns out, yes, GE is going there. The cost per job is somewhere around $400,000, and it really makes no sense. So that's what's interesting is a lot of cities watched that Boston situation unfold and decided to go another way. The other thing that's behind us is the war between the cities and counties. Often, particularly in the Deep South and in parts of the Midwest, cities and counties would fight over where to locate a business. That is rapidly changing. Now the idea is, let's locate the business, let's get the jobs, let's all work together, maybe even do revenue sharing, which I think is a concept in economic development that's relatively new, and try to make it a win-win proposition. And it's working. I was just in Michigan. I saw it work in a county and city. I was in South Dakota. I just saw that work in a city and county. They decided to share the revenue. So this can be done in a way that's a kind of a win-win for everybody. The way we're looking at economic development now, and I think millennials can really relate to this, is let them come to you. Create a community that has a quality of life that matters, and environmental quality, financial quality, good schools, cultural institutions, a social life that matters, life satisfaction skills and activities. That is essential, because what's rather interesting in terms of changing face of economic development is, rather than these site selectors just going out and saying, well, here's the best deal for you because you can get this incentive, you can get this tax abatement, and you can get X, Y, Z. People actually want to live in this community, so maybe we should start looking there. As I said, smokestack chasing, which was a term used in the 40s and 50s just to, chase industry, that ended years ago. I mean, the subsequent approaches have failed as well, by the way. So the whole idea of letting people come to you makes sense. Now, each generation, as I put here, reinvents how we do economic development. What's been very interesting is the last 20 years has stayed pretty, in terms of people under, let's say, people who are now 40, that group has stayed pretty much the same in terms of how to attract business and create a good environment. Create a good environment and let them come to you. That was said by IBM, who, by the way, relocated to the waterfront in Boston. But the whole notion of just marketing and saying, "Hey, we're the best because we've got the, we got the best this, we got the best that." Just create a good environment, and then people come to you. One of the amazing things to me is there are hundreds, and if one really wants to get technical, including community development corporations and some planning organizations, there are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of organizations chasing very few relocating firms in the course of a year. Think about that. All of that money spent to attract just a few businesses. The amount spent on that, as I put here, the amount spent on economic development incentives dropped 40% from 2008 to 2017. That includes tax abatements, off-site improvements, and low-interest loans. So, again, I think that the whole notion here is to create some sort of internal sense of, we are good, you should come here, rather than, yeah, we got a lot of good stuff, we're going to market the hell out of it, then you should come here. And I think that's a big change. So some of the new trends in economic development that we're seeing, and maybe some of you have seen these in Virginia or not. If not, you can certainly call my firm. We can direct you to the folks that can help. Many incubators are popping up all over the U.S. and in Virginia. There are 8 in Virginia. Many incubators or accelerators, and we often now call incubators and accelerators, they're interchangeable. Sometimes they share customers. They may be competitors. They may even share employees, but they all have a need for a new product. So they get together and create these little kind of mini incubators, sometimes just done in a storefront or upstairs over a storefront. There are great examples in Akron, Ohio, and Birmingham, Alabama, that I've seen recently. And again, these are competitors often, and people who even have employees that work part-time at each firm. And we're seeing the development of new business coming out of these incubators. And I think that's one of the wonderful trends that's being ignored across the country. And I'm currently doing a study, and right now we found 45 of these mini incubators, not full-scale incubators and accelerators, but mini incubators where in smaller communities people are sharing services. But that also brings us to incubation and acceleration. Now, incubation has changed since the early days. When I first got involved in retail incubators, it basically meant sharing a fax machine, maybe a loading dock, a color copier, or if you were lucky, it was a color copier, a computer. Now, this has really changed. We're an incubator today, and this is one of those changing phases of economic development. It brings in worldwide talent. In fact, an incubator in Mansfield, Ohio, I saw recently, was Skyping in somebody from Taiwan to participate in the creation of a new product. There's absolutely no reason that people have to be under one roof. And so as we talk about globalism, this is, I think, essential in that we look to reach out via technology and bring in people with skills that we may not have. Venture capital firms, and I work with a lot of venture capital firms across the country, looking for startups, including small retail startups in downtowns, are intrigued by this approach because it marries complementary companies. They may have somebody in XYZ country. In fact, in one case, another example, Australia, where a guy had a part of a jacket that worked well in cold weather, but there was another company in upstate New York that had different parts of that. So they were able to do that just by Skyping, by email, by talking, and not a lot of travel money. So, as you can see in the little square, there are a lot of business incubators in the United States. But I think one of the things that we have to get through our mind is that business incubators are not all the same. There are several types of business incubators, and we can be using them in small communities. We can be using them out of people's homes. We can be using them out of people's garages, and we can be using technology to access people around the globe. So I think that's one of those things that's that technology has given us with respect to business development. Now, traditional incubators and accelerators are still alive, and that should read but changing, but I have by changing. Economic development agencies spend 30% more now than 10 years ago on incubation. And many are committed to buy local programs for incubation projects. So if you're thinking about setting up an incubator, and this is much different than it was years ago, a lot of local providers can be employed. Again, worldwide collaboration. I know a lot of you live in college towns, substantial university inducement, licensing, and student equity, giving equity to students who are starting projects and incubators. That is, it's creating a lot of wealth among young people. Where I'm seeing it most is a little bit here in Virginia at UVA. Mostly in the Midwest, in the larger universities, and also in of course California, which you'd expect, and also in Arizona. New York State is trying to start a program for that right now. But incubators that provide some sort of inducement and student equity. That's the changing face of economic development. That if somebody had mentioned that 20 years ago, they would have been laughed off the stage. Think tanks are also spinning off accelerators, but they're not just doing them out of Washington D.C. or Los Angeles or New York. They're creating think tanks through local chambers of commerce, where chambers of commerce then can create business accelerators. And that's something that I would say is new within the last 5 years. And again, one of the changing faces of economic development. I know that for a fact in Virginia that there is been talk in the legislature about creating accelerators that give students equity. So that may be something you want to talk to your local representatives about. Let's talk about infrastructure a little bit. And this is something that has changed in economic development significantly. Large businesses, including the Walmarts of the world, and I've written over the years in books and journals about the effect of Walmart, have often demanded these major infrastructure changes, including off-ramps and these widened roads that just do little for not only the aesthetics of a community, but for the planning of a community. These demands still exist, and I think there's now more, I hope there's more public awareness of the long-term costs of this type of infrastructure. I think it's costing communities way too much. The return on investment, and I do those studies all the time, just does not make sense to put that kind of money into major infrastructure. And fewer communities are actually rolling over, and particularly for retailers. First of all, we have an issue with retailing. It's dying. It's not doing as well as it was even 2 years ago. So when it comes to infrastructure demands, we're looking, I think, at changes. And as I say here, a simple cost-benefit analysis, and I can do one in about 15 minutes, reveals these changes aren't needed. And, I say this is a change from even 10 years ago, but I would say even from 5 years ago, and I know 20 years ago, infrastructure spending for things like off-ramps and other infrastructure to support major retail organizations was just, it was huge. So that's a change, another changing face of economic development. Parking. Parking was never really thought of as an economic development issue, but actually it always was. The company that wanted to locate, a retailer that wanted to locate, the organization that wanted to locate, even the Chamber of Commerce that wanted to locate, wanted parking and more of it. And that's long been a demand of the economic development community. And it's often been built into zoning. And so I reach out to you planners on that. Now, planners have now figured out we don't need nearly as much parking as we thought we did over the years. Economic development folks are now easily living with less parking. However, this fight continues to play out daily. And I'm sure many of you are at planning board meetings, planning organizations, boards of appeals, etc., fighting over parking. But parking is not an economic development driver, period. I can cite you 20 studies, heck, I can cite 30 studies that say that parking is really not an economic development driver. Now, it can be in the case of like a major transit areas and so forth. And, you know, New York, Washington, and LA, Chicago, more parking for, you know, people who want to take public transit into the city, but not that big a deal. Charrettes and public participation. This is one that's very important to me. I run a lot of charrettes. I try to do them so they're accessible to the community and not so expensive as some organizations charge. Planners have, I think, have always been the ones seeking public input and doing public outreach programs and asking for information about development projects. The economic development community, and I'll read my words here because I believe it, has been abysmal with respect to seeking public input. And they've been guided in the main by planners that have been top-down community organizers. So what I mean by that is that often major developers will simply say, look, we're going to get community organizers, we're going to get them behind our project, but it's going to come from the top down here. And eventually people are going to have to accede to our needs. What's very fascinating to me is that economic development agencies are now doing multi-day charrettes, and not just the Congress for New Urbanism approach, which I use, and then I use other approaches as well, to plan for business spokes or sectors within a community, or even engage credible community outreach professionals. They are, I can tell you within the last month, I have seen 14 charrettes done, instituted by planners. And it was all to create a better project and to engage the community. This was not a charrette done because the planning department or the planning director said, hey, we need a charrette. So, you know, sometimes developers come around, and I'm glad because some of them are hiring me to do them because I think they're more accessible. But I think public participation and public outreach is now changing, and that's changing the face of economic development. It used to be a planning function. Now I also think it's an economic development function. Aesthetics. You know, back in 1986, even planners in a community thought aesthetics fell well down the list of community needs. One of the changing faces in economic development is citizens are demanding communities that are visually appealing. You just can't plop down a Walmart or a CVS or a Kohl's or a strip mall absent aesthetic considerations anymore. You can. It's done in some communities, but the trend is changing, and I think that's a trend that we can all get behind. The interesting thing is site selectors for major change actually brought the economic development community along on that one. They saw sales went up when aesthetics improved. I will say I've had to pay my penance. I started my career before doing downtown revitalization in Lowell, Massachusetts, as a site selector for CVS pharmacies before I went to grad school, and we decimated some neighborhoods, or we would take over an old pharmacy and make it look really lousy. So I hope I've paid my penance over the years, and because I think that the aesthetics do matter. The other thing is that architecture used to be an afterthought, and in neighborhoods, and in especially new neighborhoods. Now, I give great props to CNU. They do wonderful work in terms of all of that. But today, it's also a key economic development component because it sells. It sells. And so a good-looking neighborhood will sell. Good-looking buildings will sell. Real estate, it's interesting. Economic development people, myself included, we're always invested in the importance of real estate. I worked on staff for a real estate developer. The younger generation of economic development professionals has made it their business to understand commercial real estate at all levels. And I find that fascinating and wonderful. I've seen young economic development professionals sit down and run a pro forma as well as a 75-year-old real estate development professional. So I think that's a big change in the field. And I think real estate just being spoken of generally in terms of aesthetics, architecture is a huge change in economic development, and one of the changes that we probably should have addressed years ago. Branding, big change, huge change in economic development these days. Yeah, the old ones, which you see there on the screen. I love New York, and one for Greece and Madrid, Stockholm one, which I always liked. But what's very interesting is, and I will say this because I actually wrote a paper about this years ago, branding efforts in economic development circles were pathetic and amateurish for generations. That's changing, and I think in great part, studies that I'm doing anyway, the internet is changing this and is creating a sensitivity to branding. But also millennials have developed a real sensitivity to branding. And it's not just cities we're branding, it's also neighborhoods within the cities, even smaller cities. I was just in a small city in Ohio, and they branded 3 neighborhoods in addition to branding the city. And so that's a change in economic development that I think is for the better, and I hope we continue with that because and there are firms that specialize in it, but you don't have to pay that much money. There are opportunities online to brand and to create new a new sense of a neighborhood, and I think we all know some of those. I want to talk a bit about the creative class, and I know at this point your eyes are probably rolling. Obviously, it was a term popularized by my colleague Rich Florida. I've known Rich for years, and not well, but we always bump into each other in cities in which we're working, which is kind of interesting, or living. I was living in Toronto or Pittsburgh, or DC or wherever. And he's had to apologize as of late because, the creative class approach that he advanced didn't have that that real impact and far-reaching impact that he suspected that it would. And he's apologized in his latest book, and I accept it. But he was right on many levels, you know. And I think some of you in smaller communities ought to think about this. Many neighborhoods were revitalized by the creative class because of the coffee shop, because of the independent bookstore, because of the person willing to open a creative store or a creative space, or creative meeting space, whatever. That owes to Richard Florida. So while he's had to apologize, and I think that's appropriate, this is a permanent change in economic development going forward. No, the creative class is not going to change every city, every neighborhood, every town, but it can make changes. If you're really interested in creative city work, I recommend the writings of Charles Landry. I think he's, well, I will say this, I think he's better than Richard Florida when it comes to this. He's got a number of books out. Some of them are a little dense and a little tough to get through, but he really understands the creative class, and I think he is a change agent in economic development, which is what we're talking about today. The Millennial Factor. Oh my God! If I have to hear one more thing about, you know, millennials and the good, the bad, and what they've changed and so forth. I'm a baby boomer. I lived through some of that myself. I mean, you know, we were this, we were that. There are great things in economic development, though, about millennials. Much more collaborative. We know that from study after study. Demand physical space that allows for creative interaction with peers, and wants to be heard up the chain of command. What part of that is bad? And already this has changed traditional economic development. And I'm amused by this when I have friends who do recruiting for positions, you know, professional positions. But, you know, the traditional Chamber of Commerce sales approach, where they would, something out of the 50s, where they'd say, walk you around a neighborhood and talk about the quality of life, and look at this school over here, and isn't this neighborhood wonderful? Now we're looking at different things. Interesting neighborhoods, walkable neighborhoods, open space, creative opportunities. Yes, education is still important, of course, for children, and some of those things won't change. But it's very interesting that change has taken place. And I think the economic development community has really been kind of slow to come to terms with this reality. But the scene is changing fast. Local economic development agencies, universities, city halls are finding the entrepreneurial approach of the millennial generation is driving innovation at a much, much faster rate than other generations. Even while short on capital, which many millennials are, but long on innovation. So, and the demands of millennials have changed the way we develop cities and economic development, housing near public transit, bike lanes, walkable neighborhoods with essential services nearby. So I think we need to talk about millennials as the biggest changers of economic development. Public transportation, walkability, and biking. Well, I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Economic development agencies never cared about public transit unless it was a major metropolitan area. We had to park people before they went into a big city. That is changing as rapid bus lanes, bike lanes, light rail are being called on, even in smaller cities. Smaller cities, cities under 20,000 are calling for a lot of those things. That wasn't envisioned even 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, frankly. 35% of millennials now use alternative transportation approaches to downtown. So I think, it's important that we talk about that. Education, we're getting near the end here, but the economic development community has long, and I'm going to give them credit, understood the importance of education. And we're talking about education, at PhD level for engineers or master's level people to attract business. But today, more and more economic development agencies are investing in public schools, community colleges, and trying to ensure a more diverse workforce, and even creating and paying for them through the agency for training programs that are being funded by cities and economic development agencies. Well, this is one near and dear to my heart, the Boomer Brigade. This is a group that is too often overlooked, and planners, please, statewide, do not overlook this. Baby boomers. Plenty of capital. Worked for years in a corporate environment, and I'm reading off the page here, but I want to emphasize this. Now want to start a creative business, many. Rate for boomer business development is rising between 12 to 15% a year. And retirement is no longer taking place at 65, but often well into the 80s. Many progressive economic development agencies are even establishing networking groups between boomers and millennials to help them come up with businesses that make sense long term. So let us not forget the boomers. And if for no other reason, and you want to create businesses in your community, they've got money. The home office. Look, it used to be a pleasant little part-time endeavor. You work out of your house and part-time. This is now a booming workforce, and it's up 40% in 10 years. It presents urban planning problems, and some of you planners may want to talk about this because often it's not allowed at home. And more and more communities are changing zoning laws, and I can give you examples from across the country. Entrepreneurs, many of whom are loners, frankly, find it easier to sometimes work at home. However, shared workspaces are also expanding all over Virginia. And, we have several here in Richmond, but, where people get together so that they're not feeling alone during the day, and they can work together and share services and be more creative. This is one that is near and dear to my heart since I started in the downtown revitalization community. The return to downtown movement. Now, some can say it's 40 years old, some can say it's 30 years old. The fact of the matter is the last 20 years have been the most solid in terms of the return to downtown. Right here in Virginia, the Main Street program has revitalized downtowns, and there are many other communities that are using other approaches. I was proud to do the keynote at the 25th anniversary of the Main Street program here in Virginia years ago. All of the things that millennials and boomers are looking for: livability, interesting stores, walkability, a sense of community, and appeal to entrepreneurs. The economic development community has, even to this day, kind of looks down their nose at downtown revitalization, but it is a big change in the economic development world, and I think that's one of the things that I'm very proud of. I've been involved in that movement for years. One of the other things that I'm actively involved in is retail incubators, incubating businesses in downtowns. So taking a building, starting with a few people, and then launching them out into the community. So that's a change too that I think we can all be proud of. And then the last one, it's globalism like never before. And I think this is obvious, but to any of us under the age of 95. But, international trade was always an economic development mainstay. A visit to, this country or that country, and the governor would go here and the mayor would go there. But today, global collaboration is taking place at lightning speed. And it's taking place because of the web, and young economic developers are just immersing themselves in global affairs. So they know what's going on in terms of business communities and around the world. So I think there's we always liked globalism and urban trade, or international trade rather, but it's changed, and it's the face of that has changed in the last 10 years in ways that are remarkable. That's it. I'm done, folks. For more information, it's up there on the screen. I'm happy to take questions if there are any. Planners usually have very few questions for economic development people, but I'm more than happy to take them.
All right, we do have one question, Chuck, and it's from Christine Gleckner. She says, please share your thoughts about the Amazon site selection and Virginia's prospects in particular.
Okay. The question is, what do I think about them locating here? From an economic development perspective, Amazon locating here is marginal at best. The jobs don't pay particularly well. People are overworked. Amazon needs to find. I work a lot through the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. I think that Amazon needs to find a new model for distribution locally, and probably needs to do that within the structure of paying people more and working them a little less.
All right, that's it. We don't have any more questions. So thank you. I think that was a great webinar for this Monday, and thank you for joining us, everybody. As a reminder, this webinar is good for 1 CM credit if you just watched it live. We'll post this to our YouTube page, APA Virginia, within 24 hours. And our next one again is Monday, October 23rd with FEMA Region 3. And actually, we have one more question that just came in. Chuck, if you don't mind, it says the presenter stated that the jobs don't pay well. Is he aware that this is a second headquarters location? It is not a warehouse or shipping center.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Sure. The presenter stated the jobs don't pay well. Is he aware that this is a second headquarters location? It is not a warehouse or shipping center.
Yes, I am aware. And I would repeat that I believe the jobs are not, that people are not adequately paid. Yes, I am aware.
Okay. Alrighty. Well, thank you again for doing this with us, Chuck, and I hope everyone has a great rest of your Monday.
Thank you. Take care, guys.